But the interesting thing that happens is the whole language of business became biological. The chief executive of the new firm, the senior manager, got to be called the what of the firm? The head, right. Head is a biological concept. You never talk about the head of a machine. Stafford Beer wrote two wonderful books, and I'm sure many of you have read. One's called The Brain of the Firm, and the other's called The Heart of the Enterprise, biological analogy. The firm was seen that way. The firm got to be called a corporation, not a company. What's the stem for corporation? Corpus. What's corpus? Body. Biological. Now, in World War II, we went through another transformation for a series of reasons. The principal one was this. The bulk of the American workforce was drawn into the military. They were drafted, voluntarily or not, and I can attest to that. At a time when we demanded greater productivity from our industrial machine than we ever had in the past, which means we had to get substitutes. So who did we get to substitute for the men who were drawn into the service? Tilly the toiler, Rosie the riveter. You want to have fun, go back and look at the movies of World War II. What were they about? They were all about the feminine heroine who picked up the welding machine to fill the spot that her boyfriend left when he went to fight the war and kill the enemy, and he eventually returns and they reunite and she goes to her suburban house. It was the whole mythology of the war. It was the women were drawn into the workforce, elderly people and the young. And that was the first time in the history of enterprise that the workforce was not primarily motivated economically. Why? Well, you see, when we were inducted in the Army, our pay, well, you wouldn't believe it, $21 a month. Now, you couldn't support a family on $21 a month, even in 1942. But you didn't have to, because you got an allowance for each dependent. So your dependents could live above the poverty level, but not luxuriously, while you were in the service. You didn't have to worry about them, and they didn't have to worry. So the people who went to work in the workforce did not have to work in order to survive, and it was the first workforce that didn't. And therefore, it had a different attitude towards work. It said, if you want me to work, you're going to have to pay attention to me. I am not a machine that you can use as you see fit and discard when I don't serve your purposes. Because I'm here because of patriotism and loyalty to a national cause, and you better pay attention. And for the first time, management had to begin to think of the workforce as human beings. Now, that was augmented in several ways. All kinds of curious things broke out at the end of the war. Here's the corporation here, or society, or a hospital or a school. It's a system. And what happened were two movements. One is parts of systems began to organize to protest the way that the system was affecting them, the system of which they're a part. He said, look, I got purposes of my own, and I want you to pay attention to them. And if you don't, I'm going to screw you up. Right? You recognize this? Of course you do. This was the race movement, where minorities protested the way society was serving their interests. It was women's liberation, where people differentiated by sex were protesting the way society served their interests. It was the generation gap problem. It was the alienation from work problem. There are a whole series of problems that go under the name humanization, which had to do with the fact that society was becoming aware of the fact that the employed people are human beings with purposes of their own. Now, simultaneously, groups are forming outside. We're protesting the way that the organization is affecting them and saying, you start to pay, serve my purposes better or I'll mess you up. You recognize them? Of course you do. That was the ecological movement, the consumerist movement. All of a sudden, managers of systems found themselves confronted with three different levels of purpose. The purpose of the organism itself, the enterprise, the purposes of its parts, and the purposes of the larger system of which it's a part, and the other systems in that environment. And none of these levels were the objectives compatible. The nature of management went through a fundamental change. We haven't caught up with that yet. That's the problem that confronts management, because it's still managing biological organisms. is still acting as though the corporation is an organism. Because you see what happens is there are systems that are machines, there are systems that are organisms, and there are systems that are social systems. You can treat a machine as an organism. If you do, it would be stupid. You don't treat an automobile as though it has as its objective survival and growth. But you do treat organisms as though they're machines. We do it all the time. So what we do is we have a tendency to treat organisms as machines and even social systems as machines. Now, it has certain usefulness, but it's not nearly as useful as looking at a social system as a social system. And the way to look at an organism and a person is not as a social system, but as an organism. And the way to look at a machine is as a mechanical system. That's one of the things we're learning. Now, one last point, and then let me open the floor for discussion. The machine